The rain came in heavy sheets, drenching the city streets and amplifying the hollow clatter of footsteps on the pavement. Neon signs flickered above cracked sidewalks, their garish glow reflecting off puddles like fractured mirrors. The air smelled of ozone and damp concrete, a symphony of decay that matched the city's broken spirit. Drake pulled his coat tighter, the frayed edges brushing his wrists as he ducked his head against the storm. His walk home from the laboratory was a routine he could complete blindfolded. The back streets he chose were quieter, the alleys narrower, the faces fewer. He didn't mind the solitude, in fact he preferred it. But tonight the city felt different. As he turned a corner, his steps faltered. A sound, faint and trembling, carried through the rain. It wasn't human, too melodic, too raw. It sounded like grief woven into a song. Drake paused, scanning the darkened alleyways. The city wasn't kind to those who lingered in its shadows. Thieves, scavengers, and worse prowled these streets. Yet, against his better judgment, he followed the sound. The alley was narrow and smelled of rot, the rain pooling in uneven puddles along its cracked surface. His breath caught when he saw her. A woman sat slumped against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself as though trying to hold her body together. Her skin shimmered, a deep, iridescent violet that seemed to drink in the dim light. Rain streaked her face, mingling with tears that fell from wide, luminous eyes. Those eyes locked onto his, and Drake felt an inexplicable weight in his chest. She was starving, he could see it in the way her trembling hands clutched her stomach, in the sunken contours of her cheeks. Her lips parted, and she made another sound, a keening hum that carried a desperate plea. Drake's heart raced. She wasn't human. The violet hue of her skin, the faint bioluminescent patterns tracing her arms, the otherworldly cadence of her voice, all of it screamed alien. For a moment, fear rooted him in place. He had no idea what she was, where she'd come from, or what dangers might follow her. But then she tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, and she collapsed back against the wall, her head dropping as if the effort had drained the last of her strength. Drake moved before he could think, stepping into the rain-soaked alley. "Hey," he said, his voice steady, despite the knot tightening in his chest. "Can you hear me?" She lifted her head, her gaze meeting his once more. Her expression was hard to read, alien features defied human understanding, but the pain in her eyes was universal. She reached out a trembling hand, and Drake hesitated for only a heartbeat before kneeling beside her. "I'll help you," he said, his voice softer now. He wasn't sure if she understood, but her hand moved closer, brushing against his coat. Her skin was cool and smooth, almost glass-like, yet fragile beneath his touch. Her lips moved as if she were trying to form words, but the sounds that emerged were alien, a lilting language of hums and clicks. Drake shook his head. "I don't understand," he admitted, "but you need help, don't you?" She nodded, a small, hesitant motion that made his chest tighten further. There was no mistaking her desperation. Without another word, Drake shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her trembling frame. She stiffened at first, then relaxed, her body folding into the warmth. "Come on," he said, standing and offering his hand. "Let's get you out of this rain." Her eyes flicked to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. Slowly, she placed her delicate fingers in his. Her grip was weak but trusting. He pulled her to her feet, supporting her as she swayed. Her legs were long and slender, but they didn't seem built for walking on uneven surfaces. Each step she took was halting, precarious. As they emerged from the alley, the rain battered them with renewed force. Drake wrapped an arm around her shoulders to steady her. She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. A few passers-by cast curious glances their way, their faces shadowed by umbrellas and hoods. Drake kept his gaze forward, ignoring the whispered remarks and sidelong looks. He didn't owe them an explanation. His apartment building was a few blocks away, a relic of the city's better days. The elevator groaned as it ascended, its flickering light casting harsh shadows over the two of them. Drake noticed the intricate patterns glowing faintly along her arms, organic designs that pulsed in rhythm with her shallow breaths. She caught him staring and shifted uncomfortably, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low. He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. The elevator doors slid open, and Drake guided her down the narrow hallway to his apartment. Inside, the space was sparse but clean white walls, a worn couch, and a cluttered desk littered with papers and half-finished projects. He helped her to the couch, where she sank into the cushions with a soft exhale. Drake grabbed a blanket from the closet and draped it over her shoulders. Her large eyes followed him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, wincing as she shifted. He crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Is it your stomach?" She nodded faintly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. Again, her words were incomprehensible, but her distress was clear. Drake's mind raced. Was she injured? Sick? Starving? He thought back to the lab, to the medical supplies he kept on hand for his experiments. "Stay here," he said, rising. He rummaged through a drawer, finding a small scanner, a device designed to detect basic biometrics. It wasn't meant for humans, much less aliens, but it was better than nothing. When he returned, she tensed, her eyes narrowing at the device. "It's okay," Drake said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "It won't hurt." He knelt beside her again, showing her the scanner before pressing it gently to her wrist. The device hummed, its screen flashing as it tried to interpret her readings. The results were garbled, a mix of symbols he didn't recognize. But one thing was clear: her energy levels were dangerously low. If she didn't eat or rest soon, her condition would worsen. Drake sighed, setting the scanner aside. "You need food," he said. He gestured to his kitchen. "I'll make something. Stay here." As he moved to the kitchen, he couldn't help but glance back at her. She sat motionless, her alien features softened by exhaustion and trust. Drake didn't understand why she was here or how she'd ended up in such a dire state, but one thing was certain: he couldn't turn his back on her. For the first time in years, his empty apartment felt like it held a purpose. Drake moved with purpose, pulling open cabinets and scanning his meager collection of food. He wasn't much of a cook, preferring instant meals and caffeine-fueled late nights over elaborate dinners. Yet tonight demanded something more. His guest needed sustenance, and her survival likely depended on it. The rain outside had eased into a faint drizzle, its rhythm a soothing backdrop to the low hum of the apartment. From the corner of his eye, Drake noticed the woman stirring on the couch. Wrapped in his blanket, her violet skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, the intricate patterns along her arms pulsating softly, as if responding to her breathing. She watched him with a cautious intensity, her luminous eyes flicking between his hands and the strange objects around the room. "You're safe," he said, more to fill the silence than for her understanding. She tilted her head, her gaze narrowing slightly, as though she were studying him. The quiet scrutiny unnerved him. Drake was used to being the observer, not the observed. He decided on something simple: an egg and vegetable stir-fry. It wasn't much, but it was warm and hearty. As he chopped onions, their pungent scent filled the air. The woman flinched and wrinkled her nose, a surprisingly human reaction that made him chuckle. "Not a fan of onions?" he asked, setting the knife down. Her gaze lingered on the cutting board, then shifted to the pan heating on the stove. She made a soft sound somewhere between curiosity and confusion, her expression one of cautious intrigue. Drake held up an egg. "Food," he said slowly, enunciating the word. He tapped it gently against the counter, showing her the crack before letting the yolk fall into the pan. Her eyes widened slightly at the act, as if he'd performed magic. She leaned forward, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and pointed at the egg, then at him, a questioning look on her face. "Egg," he repeated, gesturing to the pan. "You eat it." He mimed eating, hoping she understood. She hesitated, then nodded, her expression softening. It was the first indication that communication between them might be possible, however limited. As the vegetables sizzled and the aroma of cooking filled the room, she stood, unsteady but determined. Drake paused, unsure whether to stop her or let her explore. She took a tentative step toward the kitchen, her bare feet soundless against the floor. Her movements were graceful but alien, each step deliberate, as if she were testing the ground for solidity. She pointed at the pan, her large eyes questioning. Drake handed her the spatula, a bold move he realized too late. She grasped it awkwardly, holding it like a weapon. He laughed despite himself and gently corrected her grip, guiding her hand to stir the vegetables. "You do it like this," he said, demonstrating. She followed his lead, her movements hesitant but precise. The spatula clattered against the pan once, and she flinched, glancing at him nervously. He offered a reassuring smile. "You're doing fine." The small act of teaching her, of bridging their impossibly different worlds through something as simple as cooking, felt surreal. Her focus on the task was intense, as though mastering this skill was a matter of survival. And maybe for her it was. When the meal was ready, Drake plated the food and placed it on the small table by the couch. He gestured for her to sit, and she complied, her movements still cautious. He picked up a fork and demonstrated eating, taking a bite and gesturing for her to follow suit. She mimicked him, lifting the food to her lips with visible trepidation. Her first taste was tentative. Her eyes widened, and the faintest flicker of a smile crossed her face. She made a soft, melodic sound that could only be described as approval. Drake couldn't help but grin. "You like it," he said. She nodded, taking another bite, this one more confident. Watching her eat with such relief and gratitude stirred something in him. He'd brought her out of that dark alley, but now he wondered if he'd also pulled himself out of something just as bleak. As she finished the meal, Drake sat back, observing her closely. The glow of her skin had brightened slightly, the patterns along her arms more defined. Whatever she was, her body seemed to respond positively to nourishment. "I don't know how you got here," he said softly, not expecting an answer. "But you're not from around here, are you?" He gestured toward the window, the city skyline barely visible through the rain-smeared glass. "You're from out there." Her eyes followed his gesture, and for a moment, something like sorrow clouded her expression. She placed a hand over her heart and closed her eyes. The glowing patterns dimmed, their light barely visible. Then she mimed an explosion with her hands, followed by a sharp downward motion. Drake's stomach sank. "A crash," he said, piecing it together. "You crashed here." She nodded, her gaze meeting his. There was an understanding between them now, a shared acknowledgement of her loss. Whatever ship or home she'd come from was gone, leaving her stranded in a world that didn't understand her. He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Are you alone?" The question felt heavy, its implications overwhelming. She blinked, her expression unreadable, and shook her head. The gesture was small but unmistakable. Someone or something was looking for her. The realization hit Drake like a blow. If she wasn't alone, then whoever was searching for her might already be on Earth. He glanced at the window again, his thoughts racing. What had he gotten himself into? As the night deepened, the woman settled back onto the couch, her breathing steady but her posture tense. Drake stood in the kitchen, his mind a whirlwind of questions and uncertainties. Yet one thing remained clear: he couldn't abandon her, not now. She'd brought a storm of mystery into his quiet life, but he wasn't the type to leave someone to face it alone. For the first time in years, his life had veered off its carefully plotted course. And despite the risks, he couldn't help but feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Drake awoke to the sound of soft rustling. For a moment he lay still, the memory of the previous day hovering at the edges of his awareness. Then it struck him: Riva, the alien woman, luminous and otherworldly, who had turned his solitary life inside out, was now his uninvited but undeniable guest. He sat up abruptly, scanning the room. The couch where she had slept was empty, the blanket crumpled in a loose heap. Panic shot through him. Had she left? Or worse, had someone come for her? "Riva," he called, his voice sharp in the stillness. The sound of movement came from the kitchen. He moved quickly, rounding the corner to find her standing by the counter. Relief washed over him, though it was tinged with curiosity. She was utterly transfixed by a metal spoon, holding it up to the light, as though it were a relic of profound significance. Her violet skin glimmered faintly, and the glowing patterns along her arms seemed brighter, more defined, after a night of rest. "Good morning," he said, his tone cautious but friendly. She turned to face him, her eyes luminous and alert. For a moment she just stared, as if assessing him, then gestured toward the spoon and tilted her head. Drake chuckled despite himself. "It's a spoon. You use it to eat." He mimed scooping food and bringing it to his mouth. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the smooth metal. Then she pointed to a glass on the counter and looked at him expectantly. He picked it up and filled it with water, handing it to her. She sniffed the liquid before taking a cautious sip. Her expression shifted: mild surprise, followed by approval. She nodded again, setting the glass down. "Guess you like that," Drake said, smiling. "Baby steps, right?" Riva's gaze didn't waver from him, and she gestured toward the table. She sat first, motioning for him to join her. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair. She pressed her palms flat against the surface, her glowing patterns pulsating faintly, and then touched her forehead with one hand. Slowly, she extended that hand toward him. Drake stared at her outstretched hand, the faint shimmer of her skin almost hypnotic. "What are you trying to say?" he murmured. She repeated the gesture, her expression insistent but calm. Against his better judgment, he placed his hand on hers. A jolt of energy surged through him, not painful, but startlingly vivid. The room around him blurred and twisted as his mind filled with alien images and sensations. He saw a vast starship, its sleek, silver hull reflecting a galaxy of stars. Inside, corridors pulsed with soft light, the same glow that now emanated from Riva's skin. Her people moved through the halls with purpose, their expressions calm yet focused. He felt their collective connection, as though they shared thoughts and emotions effortlessly. Then, chaos. The ship shuddered violently as an explosion tore through its hull, sending debris spinning into the void. Alarms blared, but the sound felt distant compared to the overwhelming sensation of fear. Riva was running, her breath labored, her surroundings bathed in the red glow of emergency lights. She reached a small pod, throwing herself inside just as the ship erupted in a blinding flash of light. The last image lingered, a view of the ship broken and lifeless, as her pod hurtled away into the darkness. Drake gasped, pulling his hand back as the vision faded. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind struggled to process what he had seen. Riva watched him closely, her expression somber, her hands now resting in her lap. "Your ship," he said, his voice low. "It was attacked." She nodded, her luminous eyes filled with sorrow. She touched her chest, then pointed to him and mimed an explosion, her fingers splaying outward. "They're looking for you," Drake said, piecing it together. "Whoever destroyed your ship, they're coming." Riva nodded again, her posture tense. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, her glowing patterns dimming as if reflecting her unease. Drake stood, pacing the small kitchen. "Why?" he asked aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. "What do they want with you?" She touched her chest again, this time pressing her palm flat against it, and then mimed giving something away. Drake frowned. "You have something they want? Information? Technology?" Riva shook her head, then touched her arm where the glowing patterns pulsed faintly. She held her arm out toward him, her expression expectant. "It's you," Drake realized. "Whatever's in you, or about you, it's what they're after." Her shoulders sagged slightly, as though acknowledging the weight of the truth. Drake's mind raced. If they were coming for her, then staying in one place was dangerous. But where could they go? The city wasn't exactly a sanctuary, and he doubted they'd blend in anywhere else. As the hours passed, Riva continued her language lessons, quickly picking up words and gestures that helped bridge the gap between them. She mimicked Drake's words with a melodic accent that made even mundane terms sound like part of a song. Her intelligence, so starkly different from human norms, was unmistakable. When she pointed at him and said his name, Drake, for the first time, he couldn't help but smile. Her voice carried a warmth that contrasted with the cold fear of their situation. "What about you?" he asked. "What do I call you?" She touched her chest. "Riva," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Riva," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar name. "It suits you." Her glow brightened slightly, and she nodded, as if pleased. As night fell, the city's usual cacophony of noise faded into an uneasy silence. Drake found himself checking the window more often than he wanted to admit. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: movement, shadows, signs of the danger Riva had fled. The weight of her pursuers loomed over him, unseen but oppressive. Riva stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the street below. Her patterns flickered erratically, a sign of distress that Drake had come to recognize. He joined her, peering into the darkness. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed to a figure standing at the edge of the street. Cloaked in shadows, it remained motionless, its presence unnerving. Drake's stomach tightened. "They've found you," he murmured. Riva grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite her slender frame. She gestured toward the door, her movements frantic, as though urging him to flee. "No," he said firmly. "Running won't solve this. We need a plan." Her glowing patterns dimmed, but she nodded, trusting his resolve. Drake glanced back at the window, where the figure had vanished into the shadows. The danger was real, and it was closer than ever. But as he turned to Riva, her luminous eyes filled with determination, he felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Drake pressed his back against the door, his breath still uneven from the confrontation. The splintered wood creaked under his weight, a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Riva stood near the window, her body bathed in the dim, flickering light of her patterns. The glow, usually steady and rhythmic, now pulsed erratically, betraying her fear. She stared at the street below, scanning for movement, her luminous eyes wide and unblinking. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice carried more certainty than he felt. Riva turned to face him, her head tilting slightly, the universal gesture for a question. "They'll come back," he explained, motioning toward the door. "And next time they won't be alone." Riva nodded, her movements deliberate and graceful, but her expression remained tense. She walked to the table where the remains of their earlier conversation paper, scattered drawings, and hastily scribbled words still lay. Picking up the pen, she began to sketch. Drake watched as her delicate fingers moved quickly, drawing a jagged outline of mountains surrounded by swirling shapes. She pointed to the peaks, then to herself, and finally to him. "You want to go there," Drake said, trying to follow her logic. "The mountains. You think it's safe?" She nodded, her glowing patterns briefly flaring as if to emphasize her agreement. Her hand moved to her chest, tracing the glowing lines with her fingertips before pointing again to the mountains. Drake frowned, leaning closer. "Wait, are you saying the mountains will protect you? Or is it there's something connected to you?" Riva hesitated, then drew a small circle at the base of one peak, surrounded by jagged lines that resembled energy. She tapped the circle twice, her eyes meeting his. "Something's there," he said, piecing it together. "Something you need." He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the room. "All right, then that's where we go." He moved quickly, grabbing a backpack and stuffing it with essentials. Food, water, a flashlight, and the heavy wrench that had proven useful in the fight. He handed Riva one of his spare jackets, and although it hung loosely on her slender frame, she wrapped it tightly around herself without complaint. As he packed, his thoughts churned. Whoever or whatever the cloaked figure was, it wasn't working alone. The precision of its movements, the weapon it had wielded, all pointed to something far beyond an ordinary pursuer. Riva's attackers were organized, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The memory of her earlier vision resurfaced in his mind, the glowing sphere, the frantic escape, and the devastation that had followed. Whatever part of that sphere she carried, it was powerful enough to destroy her ship, and now it had put a target on both of their backs. Riva stood by the window again, her patterns dimming slightly as she gazed outside. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the empty pavement, and the distant hum of the city felt ominously quiet. Drake joined her, peering out into the darkness. "Do you think they're still out there?" he asked. Riva nodded once, then tapped her chest and mimed a small circle with her hands. She pointed to the door, then to the street, her gestures sharp and urgent. Drake frowned, trying to interpret. "You think they left something? Like a tracker?" Her patterns flared briefly in response, her face tightening. Drake cursed under his breath, pulling her away from the window. "All right, we leave now. No waiting." They moved quickly, stepping into the hallway and descending the narrow staircase that led to the building's rear exit. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the city streets damp and glistening under the faint glow of neon signs. Drake led Riva through the alleyways, sticking to the shadows, his senses on high alert. Every distant sound a muffled conversation, the clatter of a trash can set his nerves on edge. Riva followed closely, her movements soundless, her eyes scanning every corner. The glow of her patterns had dimmed further, as if she were consciously suppressing it. Drake glanced back at her, noting the tension in her posture. She didn't just look cautious, she looked prepared, as if expecting an attack at any moment. They reached the edge of the district, where the buildings gave way to a labyrinth of abandoned industrial lots. Rusted fences and crumbling warehouses loomed around them, their silence more oppressive than the bustling streets they had left behind. Drake motioned for Riva to stop, crouching near an old storage container to catch his breath. "We're clear for now," he said, though he didn't entirely believe it. Riva knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She touched his arm lightly, then pointed to the sky. Drake followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing. At first he saw nothing but the faint glow of the city's light pollution. Then, a shadow moved small, fast, and silent. "Is that?" His voice trailed off as the shadow circled again, its movement deliberate. It was too low for a bird, too agile for a drone. "They're watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Riva's hand tightened on his arm, and she gestured for him to move. Her urgency was clear. Drake stood, gripping the wrench tightly, and they began to run. The shadow above followed, darting between the sparse clouds like a predator circling its prey. They reached the edge of the industrial lot where a chain-link fence blocked their path. Drake cursed, glancing back as the shadow descended. It was closer now, and he could make out its shape, a sleek, metallic device, about the size of a large bird, its surface gleaming faintly. It emitted a low hum, like an electronic heartbeat. Riva stepped forward, raising her hands. Her glowing patterns flared to life, brighter than Drake had ever seen them. Tendrils of light extended from her fingertips, wrapping around the device like living vines. The hum grew louder, a sharp, piercing sound that made Drake's ears ring. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the device shattered, its pieces falling harmlessly to the ground. Riva staggered, her glow dimming as she clutched her chest. Drake caught her before she fell, steadying her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. She nodded weakly, but her expression was strained. Drake glanced at the shattered remains of the device. "That was a scout," he said. "If they weren't sure where we were before, they are now." He helped Riva through a gap in the fence, and they continued into the night. The mountains she had drawn on the paper were still miles away, but they had no choice but to keep moving. The city was no longer their ally. It was a battlefield, and they were outnumbered. As they disappeared into the shadows, Drake couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. But one thing was certain, he wasn't about to let Riva face it alone. The stars above seemed muted, their light struggling to penetrate the haze of the city left behind. Drake and Riva trudged through the uneven terrain at the edge of an abandoned highway, their breaths forming misty clouds in the cool night air. The backpack felt heavier with each step, but Drake pressed on, his grip on the straps tightening each time he glanced at Riva. She walked with determination, but the dimming of her glowing patterns told a different story. Whatever energy she had expended destroying the scout drone had taken its toll. Her shoulders slumped, and her steps faltered more often. Drake slowed his pace, letting her catch up without calling attention to it. "You holding up?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Riva nodded but didn't look at him. Her glowing eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, her focus unyielding. She gestured toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains in the distance, her meaning clear, "Keep moving." Drake scanned the horizon. The mountains looked impossibly far, their peaks barely visible against the starless sky. He adjusted the straps on his backpack, his mind racing through options. They needed rest, but stopping here, so close to the city and their pursuers, wasn't an option. He glanced at Riva again, her fragility at odds with the otherworldly power she had displayed earlier. "We'll find somewhere safer," he said, as much to himself as to her. The faint hum of the drone still echoed in his mind, a reminder of how close they had come to being caught. The shattered remains of the machine now lay far behind them, but its message had already been delivered. Whoever was hunting Riva knew their direction, if not their exact location. As they crested a small rise, Drake spotted a structure in the distance. It was a dilapidated rest stop, its roof partially caved in, and its windows shattered. A faint neon sign flickered above the entrance, the words long since faded beyond recognition. He pointed toward it. "There, it's not much, but it'll give us cover." Riva hesitated, her luminous patterns flickering faintly, before nodding. Together they approached the building, their footsteps crunching over gravel and broken glass. Drake pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rust. Broken chairs and tables littered the floor, and the faint hum of a generator indicated some lingering source of power. Drake scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. He gestured for Riva to stay back as he moved further inside, his eyes sweeping over the shadows. Satisfied that they were alone, he waved her in. "It's clear." Riva entered, her glowing patterns casting faint, dancing light across the walls. She moved to a corner and sank to the ground, her exhaustion evident. Drake set down his backpack and knelt beside her. "You need to rest," he said. "We'll keep watching shifts." She shook her head, her glowing eyes narrowing as she pointed toward the shattered windows and mind scanning the area. She didn't trust the safety of this place, and neither did he, but there was no other option. Drake reached into his backpack and pulled out a water bottle, handing it to her. "Drink. You used a lot of energy back there." Riva took the bottle, her fingers brushing against his briefly. She hesitated before taking a sip, her expression softening as she handed it back. Her glow brightened slightly, a sign that she was regaining some strength. Drake leaned against the wall, staring out the window. "We need a plan," he muttered more to himself than her. We can't just keep running. There has to be a way to stop them. Riva shifted, her patterns pulsing in response. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, crystalline shard. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting her glow like a prism. She held it out to him, her eyes expectant. What is this? Drake asked, taking the shard carefully. It was cool to the touch, its weight negligible but its presence almost overwhelming. He felt a faint hum, as though the shard itself were alive. Riva placed a hand on her chest, then gestured to the shard, miming a transfer of energy. She pointed to the mountains, her expression urgent. Drake frowned. This is part of the sphere, isn't it? You said you were carrying its essence. This is what they're after. Riva nodded, her patterns flaring briefly before dimming again. She mimed the shard being joined with something larger, her gestures deliberate and precise. They need the whole thing, Drake said, understanding dawning. And if we get it to wherever you're pointing at in the mountains, it'll be safe, or whole again. Riva nodded again, her gaze steady. She tapped her chest and pointed to him, then to the shard. Drake sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, we keep moving at first light. We'll find this place you're talking about. Before either of them could speak further, a sharp, metallic clink echoed from outside. Drake froze, his instincts screaming. Riva's patterns flared in alarm, her body tensing as she pointed toward the window. A shadow moved in the darkness, followed by another. Drake's grip tightened on the wrench still tucked into his belt. They're here, he whispered. Riva moved toward him, her hand brushing his arm as her glow dimmed to near invisibility. She crouched low, her gaze locked on the window. Drake followed suit, his mind racing. They had no way out but the front door, and the hunters were closing in. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, and a beam of light swept across the building. Riva's patterns flickered, and she clutched the shard tightly, her expression resolute. Drake motioned for her to stay behind him as he edged closer to the window, peering out cautiously. Two figures stood just beyond the broken fence, their forms shrouded in black cloaks similar to the one the earlier hunter had worn. They moved with an eerie synchronicity, their weapons glowing faintly in the dark. Drake's mind raced. He turned to Riva, his voice a low whisper. Can you do what you did to the drone? Take out their weapons. She shook her head, her patterns flickering weakly. Whatever energy she had left wasn't enough for another display of power. Drake cursed under his breath, gripping the wrench tightly. Then we fight. Riva touched his arm, her gaze intense. She held up the shard, then gestured toward the mountains, her meaning clear. He had to get it there, no matter what. Drake hesitated, his chest tightening at the implication. I'm not leaving you, he said, his voice firm. She shook her head, her expression softening but resolute. She touched his chest, then the shard before miming running. Her patterns dimmed further, but her determination burned brightly in her gaze. The hunters moved closer, their steps deliberate and synchronized. Drake's jaw tightened as he made his decision. He turned back to Riva. If you think I'm abandoning you, you don't know me very well. He stood, wrench in hand, as the first hunter stepped through the door. The faint glow of dawn cast the mountains in soft hues of gray and blue, their jagged peaks slicing into the sky like ancient sentinels. Drake staggered, his injured side screaming with each step, but the sight of their destination steeled his resolve. Beside him, Riva moved with renewed purpose, her glowing patterns pulsing in steady waves. The shard in her hands emitted a faint, rhythmic hum, resonating with the peaks ahead. It was as if the mountains themselves were calling them. We're close, Drake said, his voice a rasp. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, his body begging for rest. Riva turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, determination and gratitude. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and nodded. They pressed on, the air growing thinner as the trail steepened. The ground beneath their feet shifted from loose dirt to jagged stone, and the remnants of a long abandoned path guided them upward. The shard's hum grew louder, its vibrations syncing with the faint tremors Drake could now feel in the ground. Something awaited them ahead, something powerful. The path narrowed as they reached a plateau, revealing a massive stone structure nestled against the mountain's face. It was unlike anything Drake had seen before, a fusion of natural rock and otherworldly design. Smooth, glowing lines etched into the stone pulsed with the same rhythm as the shard, creating an almost musical resonance. The air vibrated with energy, alive and ancient. Riva stopped, her gaze fixed on the structure. She clutched the shard tightly, her patterns flaring to match the glowing lines of the stone. She turned to Drake, her expression a mixture of anticipation and fear. She gestured toward the structure, then placed a hand on her chest, miming a deep inhale. "This is it," Drake said, his voice hushed. "Whatever this place is, it's what you've been looking for." Riva nodded and stepped forward, the shard's hum intensifying with each movement. As they approached the entrance, a massive, arched doorway carved directly into the mountain, the glowing lines brightened, illuminating the path ahead. The shard in Riva's hands responded, its glow now almost blinding. She hesitated at the threshold, turning to look at Drake. "You're not going in alone," he said firmly, stepping beside her. "Let's finish this together." She smiled faintly, her glowing patterns softening as she nodded. Together they stepped into the structure. The interior was vast, a cavernous space filled with towering columns that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. The air buzzed with an almost imperceptible hum, the sound of energy coursing through the walls. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and reflective. Above it hovered a faint, translucent image of the sphere, whole and radiant. The shard in Riva's hands pulsed in sync with the image, as if drawn to it. Riva moved toward the pedestal, her steps deliberate. Drake followed, his gaze darting around the chamber. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The hunters had proven relentless, and he doubted they would let them finish this without interference. "Riva," he said, his voice low, "whatever you're about to do, make it quick. I don't trust this quiet." She nodded, her focus entirely on the pedestal. As she approached, the shard began to lift from her hands, floating gently toward the image of the sphere. The room's hum grew louder, the glowing lines along the walls flaring with intensity. Riva reached out, her glowing patterns merging with the shard's light. The connection was instantaneous. The shard fused with the sphere's image, creating a pulse of energy that rippled through the chamber. Riva staggered, but Drake caught her before she fell. The sphere glowed brighter, its light filling the room with a warmth that was both overwhelming and comforting. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance. Drake turned, his body tensing. The hunters had found them. 3 figures stepped into the chamber, their cloaked forms silhouetted against the glowing lines of the walls. Their weapons thrummed with deadly energy, their movements precise and synchronized. Riva straightened, her glow intensifying as she stepped in front of Drake. She raised her hands, the lines on her skin flaring with a brilliance that forced the hunters to pause. The sphere above the pedestal pulsed in response, its light radiating outward like a protective barrier. The lead hunter raised its weapon, its mask tilting slightly as it assessed the situation. Before it could act, Riva spoke. Her voice was clear and melodic, her alien language carrying an undeniable authority. The hunters hesitated, their movements stuttering as if caught in an internal conflict. "What are you saying?" Drake asked, his voice a whisper. Riva turned to him briefly, her expression resolute. She touched her chest, then gestured toward the sphere, her meaning clear. She was offering herself. "No," Drake said, stepping forward. "You don't have to do this. There has to be another way." Riva shook her head, her gaze soft but unyielding. She reached out, her hand brushing his cheek briefly before turning back to the hunters. She raised her hands again, her glow intensifying to the point where it eclipsed the sphere's light. The hunters faltered, their weapons lowering as if compelled by her command. The sphere pulsed once more, sending out a shockwave that knocked the hunters off their feet. The glowing lines along the walls began to converge, channeling their energy into the sphere. Riva stepped forward, her patterns now fully synchronized with the sphere's light. She turned to Drake one last time, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "Riva, don't," Drake shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the crescendo of energy filling the chamber. Riva placed her hands on the sphere, and the light exploded outward, enveloping the room in a blinding glow. Drake shielded his eyes, the force of the energy knocking him to the ground. When the light finally subsided, the chamber was silent. Riva was gone. The pedestal now stood empty, the sphere's image having disappeared. The glowing lines along the walls had dimmed, their energy spent. The hunters lay motionless, their forms crumpled and lifeless. Drake staggered to his feet, his chest tight as he scanned the room. "Riva," he called, his voice echoing through the cavern. There was no response. A sea, the shard, now whole, floated gently back to the pedestal. Its glow was faint but steady, a quiet reminder of what had been sacrificed. Drake approached it slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out. The shard pulsed once, and an image filled his mind, a vision of Riva, smiling, her patterns glowing with a soft, serene light. She was free. Drake lowered his hand, his jaw tightening. He turned toward the entrance, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. The hunters were gone, the shard was safe, and the threat had passed. But the cost was more than he had ever imagined. As he stepped out into the morning light, the mountains bathed in the warm glow of the rising sun, he felt a strange sense of peace. Riva had completed her mission, and though she was gone, her sacrifice had saved more than just him. She had saved worlds. Drake adjusted his backpack and began the long trek down the mountain. The shard's faint hum followed him, a quiet promise that her light would never fade.